right, well, we might as well get started. Today is Tuesday, and we have just two more lecture class periods. So we're coming down to the end here. Just a few announcements before we get started with today's material. Discussion number 9 should be completed. That's the last discussion of the course. So that one should be finished. Friday was the posting day and yesterday was the response day. That's the last one that I need to grade. So the discussions will be completed later this week. Today, paper number 2 is due. So I've been asking if you have any issues or questions about getting that in on time. Nobody seems to be having any trouble. So I'll be expecting your paper, your research paper by midnight tonight. Also, just a reminder, let me share my screen here. There are, the course evaluations close this Thursday. So if you plan to do any course evaluations for your STC courses, I just put a reminder here on Google, because then that way you can, see all of what's due. That's why I always put those on there just as reminders. So there will be a reminder on there about the course evaluations closing on Thursday. Also, I just thought that I would mention, this is Teacher Appreciation Week nationally. Next week is WISD Teacher Appreciation Week, because they don't like to do Teacher Appreciation Week during STAR testing. This week is STAR testing for like US history and algebra and bio, I think, those ones. In any case, this year we set up an opportunity for you to do teacher cards. Every year since East opened, we've done them in English classes. Maybe you can remember doing paper ones when you were a freshman or sophomore. Last year we weren't able to do them because everything was so chaotic. But there is a way for you to do virtual cards if you would like. I also made a video of me explaining what teacher cards mean to me, and I got out my big bag of cards because I've been teaching for a long time, and I saved all of them and basically talked about how those cards sort of make it so that I can continue through, and whenever I have a bad day, help me out and so on. So if you would like to, this is just an opportunity for you to participate in that. There's an automated website where you can choose a card and then click on it and go through a very short Google form. If you would like to, just kind of let any of your teachers know that you appreciate them, or there was something that they did to help you that you appreciated. So that's an opportunity that you have there. That's going to close next Friday. So those two things are there as reminders. Sorry, they're making announcements about the testing, so I'm trying to ignore it. All right, so today we have a discussion for Virginia Woolf, The Mark on the Wall. There is a study guide for that piece. I'm going to go through it a little bit with you, and then if there are any questions that you have about the piece, then I'll be glad to answer them. Thursday, we have The Garden Party by Catherine Mansfield. There's a study guide for that too. That one is a little bit longer, so we'll go through it on Thursday. Thursday, we'll assess whether or not we want to have class on Friday. I'll ask you if you want to have kind of like a review session where you can come in and go over the study guide for the exam. I thought I put the link on there. Let me refresh. Yeah, there's the study guide for the exam review. It's in multiple other places too, but then it's right there on the calendar for you. So Thursday, I'll kind of ask you, do you feel like you want to have a class period? Like sometimes it's better to have a class period where you can ask questions and hear me talk about some things that from the study guide that you might want me to go over. or sometimes it's better not to have class so that you can study and prepare. So I'll ask you about that on Thursday, and we'll determine that. But today we're going to go over Virginia Woolf, The Mark on the Wall. There is in the unit, there is a PDF of that selection that is separate if you go to the readings. So if you want to, you can click right here and get the PDF of the passage if you haven't already, that I'm going to go through. Do read the background about Virginia Woolf. She's an important writer from the first part of the 20th century. She, her work demonstrates a shift in many of the qualities that we were talking about last time with modernism. And that's one of the reasons that we're reading this piece today, is because there are a lot of overtones of modernism in her work. And we can use it as a good example of sort of like the beginning of the 20th century writing. So do read about her. It's not terribly long. I did highlight a couple of things in the bio, and that is, she has an essay called Modern Fiction, which is in the text, or an excerpt of it is in the text. And she writes about modernist fiction in that piece. And it's kind of interesting because she's writing about it from the perspective of someone who is in the process of working through what modern fiction is. We can look back now, 100 years later, and say, oh, now we know what modern fiction, what that movement, consisted of. But when you're in the middle of a movement, it's kind of hard to recognize that. So in a way, she's sort of forecasting what she perceives modern fiction to be and its purpose in the evolution of literature. So she says things like, the task of the novelist is looking within and, receiving those impressions and expressing them. I've also highlighted the part, and I think it's kind of important maybe to take a note on, she abandoned linear narratives in favor of interior monologues. If you didn't read that before you read The Mark on the Wall, The Mark on the Wall might be a little bit confusing because it's all about the mental process that the narrator or the main character goes through as she's thinking. And so it's an interior monologue and stream of consciousness. I'm going to talk about stream of consciousness as a narrative technique in a few minutes. But that's a difference in terms of the modern qualities of fiction that we see really clearly with Woolf. And that's why we study her. So there's a lot of also personal background there about her and her life. But let me delve into the passage for today, which is The Mark on the Wall. I chose this because it is definitely an example of stream of consciousness, but also because it's fairly short. A lot of her work is longer, and we're trying to finish off this unit, and I wanted to make sure that it was an accessible length for you. So let me define stream of consciousness for you and for your notes. You probably, if you read this passage, you probably already have an idea of what that is. Stream of consciousness is a modern technique that many modernist writers used in order to demonstrate the internal thought process. If you take a minute and just think about how your brain works moment to moment in the day, most people do not think in a linear way. It's almost impossible to do that. What happens in your brain, if you think about it, is that every moment different ideas are popping in and out, and you could look at something and be reminded of something else, and then, oh yeah, I have this thing that's due, and your brain kind of jumps around a lot. And sometimes you have to control that, like if you're focusing on an assignment or a task or whatever. So you should be pretty aware at this point in time that your brain does that. It's just the human brain. So the modernists, some of them decided to take that aspect of the way that the brain thinks, because now we have psychology coming in during the Victorian times and making its presence known more prominently in the 20th century. So people are starting to think about how the brain works and its effect on our lives and so on. So stream of consciousness is just sort of narrating in a way that captures that thinking process. So, you know, I mean, how many times have you been reading something and your mind jumps to something else and then something else and then something else, and then you go, oh yeah, I've been reading a paragraph with my eyes and not with my brain. And so that's what stream of consciousness is. And it's really self-explanatory. It's the stream with which your brain is shifting through ideas. And you can clearly see that in this piece. The genius of the mark on the wall, though, is that she's doing it to demonstrate that. And the places where her mind goes is infinitely interesting from a psychological standpoint, and a historical one too, because while this story is going on, World War I is raging. So I highlighted in a couple of key ways. I'm going to go through the passage and kind of point a few things out to you in case you want to make notes. But one of the things that I highlighted is every time she comes back to reality, which for this piece is the mark on the wall. She's sitting in a chair. She's sort of, you know, thinking about all these different ideas that pop into her head, but she keeps coming back to this mark on the wall. She notices for the first time that there's a little dot on the wall. I put my dot right there. And so her mind will wander, and then she'll come back to the mark and she'll be wondering, what is that? And then that will lead to this and this and this, and she goes off again. So watch for the pattern in this piece of her mind wandering in stream of consciousness and then consciously coming back to, just like we would refocus ourselves on a task or something. And so it's really not a narrative to show an action or like a plot line. Remember, modernism is about making it new. There really isn't a plot line. It's the plot line of her mind as she is contemplating the mark, and then where it goes randomly as she, you know, kind of slips into the different ideas that pop into her mind. So I highlighted all of the reality like signals in sort of a light blue color, because then you can see how she consistently goes back to that mark on the wall as sort of her focus. But then in between over here, I put in purple boxes all of the different general topics that her mind starts to move toward. And then you can see that she moves back to trying to figure out what that is on the wall. Could she just get up and go and look at it? Yeah, but she doesn't. And that's sort of the point of the piece, because Woolf is trying to demonstrate, you know, just that way that human beings move from idea to idea in their mind and then focus back on whatever it is that is shifting. So the very first thing is that she notices this mark on the wall. It's told in past tense. She's remembering this, and it's first person, because how can you talk about what's going on in somebody's mind without that? It kind of has to either be third person omniscient or first person. So she talks about, you know, what was going on in the room. She starts thinking about medieval knights and how it looks a little bit like a flag. She's just kind of looking at this thing that's on the wall. And maybe it was a nail, maybe this, maybe that. And then she starts, you know, thinking about, you know, maybe it's from, you know, the picture that was hanging there, maybe what would the picture been on the picture, and then she just keeps jumping from there. So she starts thinking about people who have lived in the house before her, in terms of, you know, like who might have hung this picture. She starts thinking about, you know, she imagines people living in the house that she's living in the garden and so on, but then back to the mark. That leads her to start thinking about humanity and philosophical speculation, civilization, the speed at which we go through life. She compares it to being blown through the tube, which is a reference to the trains that are there in London. She starts thinking about flowers, specifically the flowers in the land of the dead in ancient Greek mythology. The fields of asphodel are in Elysium, in the land of the dead. So she starts thinking about that, and then she sort of like trails off. Notice at the end of some of the paragraphs, you have like a trailing off of the thought, which is kind of like the way your brain works. Sometimes you just think, and then sometimes you're just staring. She goes back to the mark. It's not a hole, maybe it's something else, a leaf, something like that. And then she starts thinking about how the mind wanders from idea to idea. Probably Shakespeare's mind did the same thing. She starts thinking about how we praise ourselves. She goes back to thinking about flowers. That leads her to think about self-image, like sort of shattering that self-image. And then she starts second guessing that process of the self-image, which is another psychological element. She even speculates about the future of writers, which is interesting, and I highlighted it here on the page. And the novelist in future will realize more and more the importance of these reflections that she's having in her mind about self-image. For of course, there's not one reflection, but an almost infinite number. Those are the depths they will explore. Those the phantoms they will pursue, leaving the description of reality more and more out of their stories. And that's kind of true because we have a lot of fiction that is science fiction or speculative about the future. So she's kind of predicting in her mind that novelists will take a turn away from reality and into the reflections of life. She starts talking about generalizing. She starts thinking about the past and how they used to have these tablecloths that she remembers, which leads her to think about male-female roles, and then it brings her back to the war that is going on at this point in time. Now, some critics have pointed out that the fragmented thought process that the narrator goes through in this piece might have to do with a sort of reaction to the war, right? Like in a traumatized situation, maybe the mind has difficulty concentrating. I think I know I can attest to that from this year. So there is that element of war that could be affecting her frame of mind as she's thinking about this thing on the wall. There are times when you just don't want to be thinking deep thoughts. You just want to sort of, veg out and stare at something and not have the burden of deep thoughts. And so she's kind of going between that and then what the brain naturally does, which is deep thoughts. Then back to the mark on the wall, it seems to project. It's not circular, like she's noticing more detail about it as the piece continues. So whenever she does focus her attention back on the mark on the wall, she's starting to notice that it's irregular and that it's protruding, that it's not a hole at all, that there's something attached to the wall. Then she starts thinking, well, what if she went to touch the wall? Would it be bumpy like the battlefields? That makes her start thinking about antiquaries, which are like antique dealers, and who they are and what they do. Then she goes back to the mark on the wall. No, nothing is proved, nothing is known. And if I were to get up at this very moment and ascertain that the mark on the wall is really, what shall we say, the head of a gigantic old nail driven in 200 years ago, she starts thinking again about the generations that lived in her house before her. She thought of that already when she was thinking about who would have hung a picture on the wall. So in a way, also, she's demonstrating that psychologically our thoughts tend to cycle back around. And that's true maybe also because maybe what's more prominent in our minds for whatever reason is repeated more in our random thoughts. She talks about jumping up and seeing what it is. Maybe she's gone through a couple of different options and she still doesn't know. She starts talking about nature and the preservation of nature, how human beings have created a masculine hierarchy. And in many ways, the work of Virginia Woolf is along the lines of Wollstonecraft. It's just a little bit more subtle. She brings it back to the mark on the wall, and then she starts thinking about nature, and then the mark. I feel I've focused on it, and I feel like I'm grasping at what it could be. She's thinking about the reality versus the dream of life. And she starts having this pastoral image in her head, thinking about these trees and the tree line and, you know, just all the aspects of woods and the life cycle of trees. And that leads her to think back to all the things that she's been thinking about. And then she says, I can't remember a thing. Everything's moving, falling, slipping, vanishing. So maybe she's overwhelmed with the current events, the fact that um, Britain will probably be bombed soon, and what that means. There's a vast upheaval of matter, she says. Someone, and then she's interrupted by the fact that someone is there with her, standing over her. And that person says, I'm going out to buy a newspaper, which brings her back to the present moment again in her mind. And that's the first time we realize, as the readers of the piece, really that somebody's been in the room the whole time. And so there's this contrast between this whole inward world that she's been sort of randomly creating versus the outward world, which is quiet and we didn't even know about it. The only thing we knew about in our outside world was the mark on the wall. But there was a person there the whole time, and that person says they're going out to buy a newspaper. And at the very, very end, the person says, you know, the war's crappy. We can't go out and do anything, and you know, it's horrible. And but even the same, I don't see why we should have a snail on our wall. And so at the very end, the narrator realizes that the mark on the wall was nothing that she thought it was a snail. Now, if we just look at this piece without understanding why it's written the way it is, then it's kind of weird. And you go, okay, what was the point of watching that? But when we look at it as an example of modernism, we can see what Woolf was trying to do. It's a huge departure from the type of writing that we saw in the Victorian era or really any other era. We have this whole new way of writing. And in some ways, though, it's real because our brains do that. And when you start to realize, hey, you know, how many times in the day am I trying to focus on something, but my brain just keeps thinking about a memory or something that's going to be happening in the future, or, you know, something else I have to do, or, you know, your brain does that. And so demonstrating that is a very new thing in literature at the time that Woolf is writing. Hopefully that makes sense. Are there any questions about stream of consciousness or this piece in particular as an example of it? Are there any questions from the study guide that you would like me to talk about? I think I touched on a lot of the things that are on the study guide. But you can put a number in the chat if you'd like me to talk about any of these. All right, if anything, I'll leave that open if it, number 5, okay. What could the snail symbolize? Well, the snail in the piece tends to symbolize reality, right? Like it's her touchstone to bring herself back to reality. And that's why we see it repeated throughout the piece, because she keeps going back to focus on it as a way of bringing herself out of her cycling thoughts and into this reality situation that is going on. And the reality is not just the snail, though. The reality is the war, the possible effects of the war, you know, the whole situation of life at the time. So I think if I was going to answer number 5, I would say something about how there's this symbolism of the present time or bringing yourself back to the current situation. Number 8, how does Woolf utilize epiphany? Remember that epiphany is that sudden realization. On the surface, I guess you could say the most obvious epiphany is at the very end when she realizes that this snail that has had her mind going in circles for who knows how long. Well, she thinks it's a mark on the wall, but she doesn't find out that it's a snail until the end of the piece. So you could say that that's an epiphany. But in terms of self-realization, she has a couple of different epiphanies in the piece. And one of them is, the perception versus reality, the idea of the inward and the outward world. So I would probably say those realizations are a little deeper than just she realized it was a snail. That's kind of like the answer that you give when you're just superficially discussing the scene. All right, if any others pop in there, I'll go back to the study guide before we sign off for today. I just wanted to double check today the essay is due. So I just wanted to see if there are any final questions. I've been answering people throughout the weekend. I was looking at drafts and helping people make some decisions about their final. I know that several of you have already turned in your paper, so I'm not too worried about that, but some people have not, and they have until midnight tonight to turn in the paper. Is there anything in general that you want to ask me? This is the assignment sheet. The rubric is here. So, if you haven't looked at that, it's the standard scoring rubric for research paper. So you can kind of judge your own paper to see where are you in the range of these elements to kind of predict what area of the rubric that you'll be in. It's the same rubric that we used first semester, but that's linked also on the study guide. So the assignment sheet, so you can kind of go through that. I did have some people who over the weekend sent me their paper and said, where would you score it right now? Give me your feedback on that and what could I do to improve on that. So I gave them feedback and said, well, right now it's probably, like around an 88. If you want to make an A, I'd recommend, looking at this and that and the other and, readjusting some things. I don't tend to make comments about like exactly what you should change, but I might say, if you add something along these lines or find another resource that does this, then that's usually the way that goes. I don't think we have time at this point for that kind of feedback, but I was giving that kind of feedback this weekend to people who were sending me their papers. I don't see any questions about the research paper or any other questions from Mark on the wall. So I'll give it another minute just in case. 9 should be done. I'm going to close all the discussions pretty soon. So if you haven't read your comments on 7 and 8, which I've done over the last week or so, then you might want to go and look at that because I'm going to close the discussions fairly soon. And that way we can concentrate on the exam, which we'll talk about later in the week. All right, I don't see anything else in the chat. So Thursday, make sure that you've read The Garden Party by Catherine Mansfield. There's a study guide for that. And that may be our last class day, depending on whether or not you want to meet up on Friday to talk about the exam. So if there aren't any more questions, then I'll go ahead and sign off for today. Feel free to email me if you have any further questions, okay? All right, I hope that you all have a good day and I'll see you on Thursday. Bye.